My name is Dr. Robert Elgood. I'm a freelance arms and armour person. I've been interested for many, many years. And for the last 9 years, I've been living 4 months a year in this fort. It's the fort at Jaipur, and it is absolutely fabulous. And I can tell you that it's pretty nice when everyone goes home. You've just got the security force wandering around, most of whom go to sleep fairly early. And you can walk along the ramparts at midnight and feel it's as though it's your fort. In fact, one of the guards used to say that whenever he woke up, my light was on because I was still working. So during my time in this fort, I was brought in to catalogue the armoury, and it's a pretty big armoury, a couple of thousand pieces, but the quality is pretty variable. It's not all there. Some of it was lost in difficult circumstances, but it's still a very important collection. What is left tend to be the rather plainer pieces. The more exotic pieces went. And for those of you who are not totally familiar with the geography of India, I would point out that you can see, there's no pointer actually, but we have Rajasthan here. Up here we have Lahore and the Sikhs, and then the Deccan in this central area. Deccan is a very loose term, and then right down in the south you have Hindu states, which Vijayanagara was terribly important, the great Hindu state that held Islam at bay until the Battle of Talikota in 1565. So although it's a very large area, and there are large areas I haven't covered, those are the basic areas. You can talk about central India, but nobody frankly knows what to attribute to central India. It is one of those sort of non-areas that doesn't have a huge identity that people attribute objects to it. When I began in this field, long time back now, you used to buy books about arms and armour, and they would have Western arms and armour in the front. In the back, you had a little section called Indo-Persian, and it said Indo-Persian because they couldn't quite decide whether it was Persian or whether it was Indian, and it was just a sort of catch-all phrase to dump everything in, and they did dump it pretty much. Since that time, there have been relatively few books, and those books have used one particular book that came out in 1880, revised in 1890 by Lord Egerton, and he wrote it for the British Museum, for the V&A. And everybody has gone back and used a sort of mine to take stuff out of, and they revamp it, but really there hasn't been huge progress. So when I got the chance to work on this collection, I decided that I would stress test everything that I could find and ask, what is the reason? Why is this attributed to this place? Or what is the reason for this, that, and the other? So every sacred cow was, for me, something that had to be examined and questioned and tried to re-establish whether there was a genuine reason or whether it was just myth. And in this process, those things that have been written have relied terribly heavily on consensus and on auction catalogues. And I would stress that the auction catalogues have played a major role in actually deciding what is what. And obviously, if you're selling something, you have a duty to give it in the best possible light, the earliest possible light, make more of it, etc., etc. And there was also, for a very long period, there was a phase of saying everything was Mughal because things that were Mughal sold better than anything else. And you certainly didn't want to say it was Hindu because that wasn't going to sell very well. And of course, the person who buys such a piece immediately thinks, you know, he has bought the story as well as the piece, and he is going to promote that idea. Come what may, he is going to say, this is a wonderful piece, and I got it at Sotheby's, Christie's, whatever it is, and it is Mughal 17th century. Wonderful. And of course, if you're a very wealthy man, you spent a lot of money, you'll probably send it on exhibition. There are museums. There were a number of early catalogues. The one at the Wallace collection was terribly important, in 1914. Not many places you would rely on a 1890 book and a 1914 catalogue. You wouldn't want it for brain surgery, and you wouldn't want it for many things, actually. The problem was that many people who aspired to write books, or museum curators, when they saw this material that they had in front of them, they said, well, where can I find a picture like this, a similar object? The Wallace collection doesn't have catalogue pictures, but it does have availability being the centre of London, everybody goes to London, look at the stuff, look in the little catalogue, which used to cost £1, and they say, oh, look, here it is, it's been catalogued, this says that it's from whatever. And so they would then send off to the photographic department in the Wallace collection and say, please write the catalogue entry on the back of the photograph, and then they would publish the photograph. It happened a lot with Italian publications, I can think of immediately, where you have a book which has parroted what was on the catalogue from 1914. And I can tell you that the man who wrote the 1914 catalogue had an Indian advisor, and everything that was down as Indian, even if it wasn't. So there's a wonderful Greek firearm, for example, a karyophyli, and there it is described as Bundelkhand in India. So it is a most unreliable thing, and more than 50% wrong. So I am afraid I am being rather radical in what I say, and I should explain that one book came out, which is this one here. Anyone's welcome to look at it after the lecture. It's the collection in Jaipur, because part of the way through I was invited to look at Jaipur. But in fact, my main work, the first thing I was promised to do was for the Maharaja of Jaipur, and so I didn't take anything that belonged to him from his catalogue. And the two collections are very different, and in some ways they complement each other. So what I've said in this was fine, but it's 2 years out of date. My continuing work has pushed some things I would amend slightly, but basically it's okay, I think. But there's some very controversial things in here. But if you think this is bad, you wait till you see the next one, because there's some really shocking things that you'll find in the next book, which will really rock the boat and say, I'm out on a limb. Okay, I show you these two pictures because they are a good example of the sort of thing that's gone before. The sword up the top is in Bikaner, and it was attributed to Akbar. Everybody wants to attribute everything to Akbar. And the inscription, as you can see, it's not terribly clear at the range you're looking at it, but I can assure you it's an extremely bad 19th century inscription. There's absolutely no way that that is Akbar. The handle, of course, is a replacement. And I'll talk about replacements later. A very nice blade on the little picture to the right. It's a wonderful Persian water steel blade, and it has an inscription. But frankly, I think the cartouche at the bottom has probably come off a coat of arms. It doesn't look like anything you find in a Mogul context at all. The collector thought, the curator in those days, who wasn't a specialist in arms and armour, thought that the date was a Hijra date, and it isn't. And on very flimsy grounds, he attributed it to Akbar. And if you go to Jaipur Fort, I'm sorry to say, you'll probably still find the uncorrected label on the piece. So you walk around the fort, you say, my goodness, I've just seen a sword here. And if you're interested, you'll remember it, or take a picture of it and bring it home, and you will be misled for the rest of time until you actually learn to discard it. So there's a lot of stuff that all collectors and everybody are going to have to discard, in my view. There are certain things that everybody has always turned to, one of which is the miniature paintings, and the other thing is the sculpture, where you've got it, of course, in a Hindu context, not in a Muslim context. The picture on the right is a page from the Ainiqbari, and this was done for Akbar at the end of the 16th century. This is a 1620 version, which is, I don't think, it's a close copy. You can find 19th century copies where the objects have changed and the labelling has changed. They actually have Persian labelling on, and they have totally different names to the earlier text. So it's something to watch a bit. But you get an idea, the sort of thing, it's quite a useful document actually, a number of pages of weapons. And the piece on the left turned up in an arms fair. I walked in and saw it, and I couldn't believe that I could find it. These things do exist. They're still around, but as you can see, it's terribly plain. Now, most museums are interested, and most collectors too, let's face it, are interested in stuff with nice gold patterns all over it, you know, gems, whatever. It's all sort of very flashy stuff. Understandable, really. But if you're really looking for the early stuff, it's pretty plain. In fact, it's terribly plain, a lot of it. There's very little that is really early that is jewelled. This is a big subject. I mustn't get waylaid by it. I develop it at length in the Jaipur book, which should be out around Christmas time. This is a statue from Ossian. One knows the date when the buildings were put up, but the date when the sculpture was added is a little bit ropey. Actually, no one can be quite sure when the sculpture comes. A sculpture which is separated from a building, it becomes almost impossible to date because, well, not impossible, but it becomes exceedingly difficult to place and date. But you can see that the dagger that the person being disemboweled is wearing is very similar to the previous piece. And that has a range of I mean, they were probably building that about the 9th century up to the 12th century. It's as bad as that. No one, if you talk to the archaeologists, no one is quite sure. The architectural historians can't really help you too much. But the fact remains that that particular design carries right through for 400 years, 500 years, it's hard to say. Nothing very much gets wasted in India. Things get recycled, but a lot of things get kept. So it becomes exceedingly difficult. But that is a huge difference, I think, from this terribly famous piece, which you'll all know. I'm afraid it's from the Wallace collection. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure. What's really interesting is that there's another one just like it in Kuwait, which I know very well. I spent 9 weeks recently in Kuwait looking at them, the collection, very fine collection that Sheikh Nasser's put together. The scabbard here is not original. That's something that you must all, as collectors, get to know, that it is perfectly normal to take the scabbard away. You're wearing new clothes for a wedding, you look and you say, oh God, the moth's got in the scabbard, have a new one made, or you've lost the scabbard. And they're terribly casual, all of them, about how they treat the scabbard. So the scabbards get replaced or lost or swapped from one piece to another. Not a good guide to very much. Sometimes you could say, well, this does belong. I mean, this was clearly made for it, but heaven knows when. This is, in fact, a Jaipur enamel piece. The problem with this particular piece is that there are... The Kuwait piece has a slightly different design. That design is perfectly recognizable. You can see it in the miniature paintings. I don't think there's any problem about that. This one has a decoration that is rather more difficult. Oh, sorry, I jumped. It's not like anything that really fits with the Moguls, and this is a great problem. The Moguls were enormously good at hoovering up everything in India that they came across that was good and bringing it into their own fold, so to speak. They, after all, came from a fairly humble. They had good pedigree in terms of being ruling class in Central Asia, but they were living in tents, and they came and they overran a very, very sophisticated society. And it's slightly like a successful burglar moving in next door and ingratiating himself with the neighbors who are aristocrats because he is so generous and so good and so exciting to be with. And I mean, he was a truly, they were really great. They were the great Moguls, not unreasonably. But they were awfully good at hoovering stuff up. And the Mughal state worked by actually raiding their neighbors and bringing in the loot. And if you had enough loot, the ruler kept what he wanted, and then he handed it out. And so you got the best warlords who would all want to come to your court because you were the man who was handing out wonderful diamond, ruby, and whatever. So you can imagine the system had to keep expanding, or it collapsed. And when it did cease to expand, it did collapse. When the Rajputs had lost interest and refused to turn out in 1739, when the Persians invaded Nadir Shah, the Mughals were finished. That was the end of them. The genius of Akbar was to incorporate the Rajputs into his system and give them space and promote them and make them feel important. And he also was jolly careful to send them out to administer very distant parts of the empire, well away from their home bases. And he maneuvered them very well, and he was truly a great man. Some of his successes weren't quite so great. But one of the justifications that the Emperor Aurangzeb had for killing his brothers was which obviously sat on his conscience, was that the Rajputs, the ulama, the religious people, said that he was the person who was most likely of all the brothers to bring in the booty. He was going to keep the state expanding. And he did so slightly against the ulama by attacking Muslim states in the south, which they didn't approve of, although they weren't actually Sunni, of course, they were Shiite. Anyway, all I'm saying is that the design has connections with the south, and the fact that the three blades are clearly from the same workshop does suggest they came from the same place. So I think, reluctantly, I have to say that that is a copy of Southern. or influenced by southern jewelers. They may even have brought a southern jeweler back. But the fact the blades, because there's another one I found in Jaipur Fort, the handle had gone. I mean, that's that thing you've just seen, probably 5 million, something like that. It's enormously valuable. I think that they were actually made in the workshops of the Moguls, the Karkhana. Now, I show you this because of the umbrella mark, which actually cropped up in conversation half an hour ago. The tradition that everybody in this field has held for a long time is that the umbrella mark is a sign of the Moguls. Well, that's quite true, it is. However, there are far too many pieces that are genuinely Mogul pieces which don't have the umbrella mark on. Big problem, because the Moguls ran a pretty good court. You're not going to tell me that Akbar got up one morning and said, oh look, they forgot to put the umbrella on my dagger. So it's not going to happen. I don't believe it for a second. And so I started to look at how the Moguls made gifts, because it's very central to giving. They gave an awful lot. You read any of the reigning families' documents, the Akbarnama, the Jahangirnama, accounts of court life, which are very careful. They all talk about an enormous number of gifts, particularly of swords and daggers. The reason was that when the ruler gave a sword to someone and they accepted it, they were becoming, there's a system called khilat, and you used to give clothes, another thing. The more personal the clothes, the more generous the gift. When the man literally took his coat off and gave it to someone and they put it on, they became an extension of his power, and they were expected to go out into the world and act as his. They actually call them limbs. So if you've got a man 500 miles away, you want him to be doing what you would want him to do if you were the ruler. You empower him. Perfectly understandable. Now, at certain times of the year in the court, the rulers had to hand out presents to sort of 500 people. And so they would get their workshops to make things. So you would have 500 suits of clothes ordered for Nowruz or whatever the festival was. Perfectly straightforward. Now, he didn't wear those. And he also, he had a lot of swords, and they accumulated vast quantities, but some of them were terribly valuable. And if you were going to hand out a large number of swords, you would actually have them made up for the occasion. And you have then a terribly interesting situation. The man, I believe, did not have the umbrella put, the emperors did not put the umbrella on their pieces. I believe that what happened was that the umbrella was put on by the people who received the piece to indicate that it was an imperial sword and a thing of authority. After all, many people in India were illiterate, aristocrats, great system of poetry and all the rest. But if you look at the great mass of the people, a symbol is much more impressive. Of course, it's going to have a wonderful jeweled hilt, but that umbrella mark was, I think, put on sometimes actually in the royal workshops. Sometimes it explains the huge variety, some of which are fakes. There are a lot of appalling fakes. I don't think every umbrella mark is genuine. It isn't. There are lots and lots of fakes. But you can have a situation, for example, there was a man who was very, very close to Aurangzeb. He actually had the job of administering his will. I think you trust someone very closely if you give them that job. He was described in the contemporary literature as the first quiver in the first arrow in the quiver of the emperor. It's a lovely description. The first arrow. The one that the emperor pulls out when he has a problem. He's a little man, he was very ferocious and he did all sorts of things. The emperor really liked him, clearly. And he was sent off to pick up Shivaji's son, who they just captured. Shivaji, one of the great enemies of the Moguls. And I believe that the emperor gave him Shivaji's sword. It's one that actually crops up in this book. I found it. And if it had been given by the emperor, he would not have had his name on because it had never been his. He'd merely passed it on. It has an inscription showing a connection with the Mughal emperor, and it has an umbrella, but clearly in that sort of situation you will not have an umbrella. It wasn't originally a Mughal piece. It was a passed-on piece, and the recipient has to show his gratitude to the emperor, and he does it by putting a suitable inscription and an umbrella. That's my theory, anyway. And I have a chapter about it, trying to argue the case, and you must make up your mind if you agree or not. Now, one of the things that happens in the 19th century, which is of crucial importance in this field to understand, is that there is a huge demand for arms and armour. Once the mutiny is over, large amounts of arms and armour are scrapped by the British. They're not going to have that. And they also stop people making weapons. You have to have a license. And a certain amount was sold from people who weren't allowed to keep weapons, and lots more was scrapped and turned into railway bridges and ploughshares and for linings along canals. And there was something of a shortage, actually. The British built the Suez Canal, and the arts and crafts movement came along, and all these people who, because of the Industrial Revolution in England, suddenly found themselves free to travel. They could afford to travel. They had a disposable income. They come to India. What did they want? Well, they wanted to buy a sword to hang up when they got home. They wanted to hang a sword in the hall and look as though they'd been on some of these great battles that the British had fought in India. It's understandable, really. So they looked around, and there wasn't the stuff to buy. And so you had lots and lots of craftsmen who had stopped being allowed to make weapons. Some of them were sort of moved back into it because the weaponry is out of date by this stage. Nobody cared, actually. A second mutiny wouldn't have been very serious if they'd been armed with the sort of stuff that, the traditional weapons of the early 19th century were being replaced by rifles and things. But there was a problem, and so you have two things happening. You have a lot of very cheap weapons being produced for the tourists, because the tourists drive a hard bargain. They're really cruel, and they push the poor craftsman really hard to get a cheap deal. So the craftsman responds by doing rather cheap deal objects to sell. But they also take a lot of stuff that's old stuff, that's redundant, like this piece, and they sex it up. They put gold all over it. And if you look at that, that is a perfectly recognizable 16th century Vijayanagara kata. You can find it all the time on things like the sculpture in the various temples in the south. You would see it actually illustrated very clearly. It's illustrated in my 2004 book. And the decoration is actually from Jaipur, and it has the Jaipur sun on it, and there's absolutely no question where it's come from. So there's an awful lot of that going on, and I'm afraid it carries on to modern times. If you go to a modern workshop today, they will pull open a cupboard and out will come wooden box crates with old hilts in. And if they're going to make up a sword, they'll often as not take an old hilt, which has got no decoration, just plain metal, clean it up, and then start engraving it and adding and doing whatever. And then they have a tatty old bunch of blades and they stick the two together. Normal stuff to this day, happening a great deal. That is a really interesting piece, because when you have something that is abnormal, this, believe you me, is the only one of its kind. If anyone can find another one, I'd love to hear about it. And for a long time I thought that was going to be 19th century, but in fact there was a publication in Waffen and Kostümkunde, and there is a stone carving showing that very distinct circular grip. And so on the evidence of that, I've given a 16th century date. So one of the things you have to decide is where an object is coming from, and then try and decide if the decoration is appropriate for the date, and or if the decoration has been added. And you examine these things on the basis of blade, of hilt, of decoration, the three things. This is very important because it's an encyclopedia that predates the previous Mogul document I showed you, and this is from the south. This was done by Hindu craftsmen working for the people who'd won the Battle of Talikota. And it's dated in three places, so 1570. You don't get miniatures going much back before the mid-16th century. So, you do, but they're very... they're like comics. They don't give you the detail that you want. So the weapons in this are very important. This was published, I published this in 2004. And you can see there's a sword there, and it's not terribly clear, but it has a sort of swelling just below the hilt. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit obscure. But this piece I found very recently when I was in the reserve collection at the Salajang Museum in Hyderabad, which is not very well known and deserves to be much better known. I know the type. Bob Hales has a number in his book, which I saw downstairs, but they're all plain. And this one, this type I know, there's a statue of a temple donor, it's about 1620. I published it anyway in 2004. It's really interesting because of the decoration. I've never seen such decoration. I don't know such decoration or anything else. So suddenly you have gold work that is really, really unusual, and you have to say, well, this is southern. Is this a one-off? Because you don't get that anywhere else. And then I found this, again, in the same place, and look at the quality. It's absolutely fabulous. It's really beautiful. And one thinks about Deccan painting, and there's a particular one I'm thinking of with autumn tree leaves. But it is fabulous work, and you won't find that anywhere up north. And that's really interesting, because one of the great frontiers is to recognize what is Deccan and what is northern. To separate the two is a really exciting job, and it's what I'm on to next. You can see a bit more of it there. And curious enough, I'd found another one rather similar in Kent in a collection, and that had come out of the armory in Mysore in 1799 when Tipu was killed. The general in charge at that stage had his share of the booty from the armory, and he brought that home. I don't think you will understand very much about arms and armour in India unless you understand something about the people who use these weapons. First thing to understand is that they worship the goddess. We're talking about Shastriyas, these are the warrior caste, and Rajputs are always assumed to live in Rajasthan, quite understandably, but in fact you will find Rajputs setting up kingdoms right across to Bengal and right up into Nepal. So when we talk about Rajputs, it is a mistake to think that you are limiting that area to one small area of India. They go right across. And I would suggest to you that when the Sikhs choose to become warriors, when the Guru decides they're going to become a warrior caste, they adopt the word Singh, meaning Lan, because that is what warriors actually have as a name. It is part of their whole essence. There's a great difference between the Sikhs and the Rajputs, however. The Sikhs have discussions with their gurus about the morality of fighting, whereas the Rajputs regard killing as part of their right, and fighting is part of their very. That's why they're there. That's the whole essence, is to fight and to die. And they use the battlefield as their temple to sacrifice themselves to the goddess on the battlefield. And if you get an old man who's lived long enough and survived, and some of them had 80, 90 wounds during the course of their lifetime, then he was hideously embarrassed if he was going to die in bed. And what they actually did was to send a message to their enemies and say, I shall be in such and such a place at such and such a time. Meet me with as many men as you want to fight me. And then the other side would turn up. And the two people who were going to fight, because they were very chivalrous about it, and there were lots of rules. You didn't stab someone in the back normally, that sort of thing. There was a very courteous business. And the chap would say, well, the earth can wait a few more minutes, let's have a drink first. And they would literally stand there drinking. And what they used to drink was actually opium and water. And the opium is terribly important. And in fact, if you go to the villages in Rajasthan, they'll still offer you opium. In the fort, there's the man who has the opium. It's all taken quite... Nobody thinks very much of it in the way that you wouldn't think very much of taking a glass of whiskey. It is perfectly normal sort of part of the habit. The court used to... The Maharajas used to hand out opium to every member of the court at one particular festival. Everybody drank the thing, and they were great brothers. And so, of course, if you have taken a lot of opium, you are, in fact... partly proof against being hurt. You can be stabbed and it doesn't stop you, you keep going unless they've hit something vital. So you have people with an enormous number of wounds on the battlefield who are still able to keep going. And once you've drunk opium with someone, you are totally committed to fighting and dying with them. And there are battles where sort of, well, there's a famous case where there was, I think, 8,000 Rajputs went into battle and 600 came out, and they had to get across the other side. There had been some treachery, and they'd been left with most of the people had decamped from their army, and the only thing to do was to get across the battlefield and kill Aurangzeb on his elephant, where he's directing it from. And the field in front of him was described like a field of saffron, as everybody in their saffron robes were lying spread out around them. One man described as having, the text says, he washed his hands of life. and having done so, managed to fight his way underneath the elephant and was killed as he was trying to cut the girth of the howdah in which the emperor was sitting. And there are lots and lots of stories like this, and if you read the text, there's a lot of sort of fuss about this is very romantic and 19th century, and there's a man called Todd who spent years there and thought they were wonderful and wrote this all up. But in fact, it's actually, I think, pretty true, actually, most of this. So anyway, you have these people high on opium with a strong desire to die on the battlefield. It is what they seek. Even small babies, if they're born, male babies, are chopped up with a sword so they can go to warrior heaven. The whole thing is hugely to be. I have developed it a long way, and I have 80 pages or something. You have to read it because it is actually an amazing story about most remarkable people who bring those values right up to the First World War. Quite extraordinary, actually. They actually carry on believing it. Very brave they are too with it, and it continues. But the goddess who they worship, it was a village goddess, and the goddess becomes popular as village worship. It's not mainstream Brahmanism at all. They're not. The Rajputs don't believe in drinking milk and behaving like Brahmins. They like alcohol. They like meat. All sorts of things they like, which are they don't have any of these caste rules about not sitting with other people. Anyone who comes along and fights next to them is welcome. They used to have a saying, "My home is from here to Chittor," meaning I can eat anywhere. There are other religious groups in India who have very strict ritual control over when they can eat and what they can do and what they can't do. Rajputs, everything is organized so they can fight. And they're told that the rest of the time in their life is when they actually go out to fight. There's a wonderful story. I'll just tell you this, and then there was a man who just got married, and he'd been sent a message by his Maharaja that he had to come and join. They were going out to fight some battle. So he was up in the Zenana, just spending a little too much time with his new wife, and he was very happy. He didn't want to sort of... and the forces were all sort of gathered downstairs in the courtyard. And finally he tore himself away and came down, got on his horse, and about to spur out the gate. And a slave came down with a tray. And so he sort of thought, oh, how nice, my wife sent me a keepsake, because it's normal to wear a keepsake when you go into battle from your wife. And he leaned over and pulled the cloth off, and there was his wife's head. And she had realized that he had not, that she was interfering with his duty and his martial honor. His honor was at stake, and she was interfering. And the story is that he tied her hair around his neck with the head, and went off and found death on the battlefield. And there are lots of stories of that sort of thing. And you may discredit some of them, but I assure you that there are an awful lot of them, and it's very much how they see things. So you have this extraordinary faith and belief in the goddess who likes blood and alcohol, and who this is the origin of chopping off the heads of buffaloes, which we're going to come to in a minute. That's a gate leading into the fort. All the gates have spikes on like that. There's a story, I left it in because there's a story about Maharaja telling his followers, get into that town. The first man in is, or perhaps the last man in is a sissy or whatever. I don't know what he said. But he challenged them all to get in first into a particular. And there was one man, a leader of a clan, an important man, because they led from the front very much. And he positioned himself with his body over the spikes and said, get the elephant to charge me. Can you imagine? So that they would burst open the gates. And in fact, what you have in Rajput forts is you have the main gate with the spikes on, and then you have a little wall in front, about 30 feet out, so that the elephant can't go straight at the gate. It has to do a dogleg, which actually takes the momentum out of it. But that's another story. But anyway, that is an indication of the sort of determination that these people have. Now, this is the earliest sword in the fort, in my view. It is a remarkable sword. It's a little difficult to date, but you can find examples. It's certainly 1400, and I dare say I could find some if I had the pictures going back further. But it is, look at the weight of it. Look at that enormous weight. Can you imagine going to battle and using that? The answer is they trained like mad, and the reason why the Rajputs were so remarkable, in my view, is that just as the Zulus invented a particular spear that gave them supremacy on the battlefield, the Rajputs, by their training, developed most enormous physical strength. And they had this mentality and the opium and the physical strength, and made them like the Spartans or anybody else. It gave them that elan that perhaps a good regiment has that makes them win. So that is a very remarkable object in itself. And you might say, well, nobody's going to use that in battle. It's much too heavy, and it's probably for taking the heads off buffaloes. That's a common thing. Most people would take that view. However, I don't think that's right. First of all, because there are far too many of them. And secondly, that. And there are a lot of these too. Now, I don't know if you can read that, but the weight of that, look at the weight, 4.32 kg. You'd have to be pretty fit to swing that around your head for any length of time. I don't know if anybody plays tennis, and you know the good weight of a... But nevertheless, to use that in the battlefield for a long time is going to require considerable strength. And it's not the only piece. Now, if that is a weapon, and it can't be for taking the heads off buffalo, if that's a weapon, then my swords are weapons too. I think that settles that case. That is a sword that is up in Bikaner, and it is, again, a sword owned by a particularly important person. He is a great hero to the family up in the fort. It's perfectly normal to keep the swords of the various Maharajas and people in the fort. You had the opportunity to do it. Why would you not do it? And often the Maharajas like to wear their ancestors' swords. They change the handles sometimes, the hilts, but they didn't change the blades. The blades is the important thing. This particular one, you can see the weight. It's a big sword, and it has a notch in it. There is a story about this. Padam Singh, who was this giant, had a younger brother, Madan Singh, and they were at Aurangzeb's court. And Padam Singh came along, and he found his brother lying on the ground with a face wound. His face had been slashed. And he said, "Brother, what are you doing lying there with this, you're a Rajput. What are you doing, a Rathor? What are you doing with this? You've just got a small cut on your face. You just had your face slashed, that's all. Why are you making so much fuss?" And he said, "It's not the wound to my face that's troubling me, it's the stab in my back." And his brother died. And Padam Singh picked up his sword and went looking for the murderers, because it was an assassination in the court. And he found the two murderers. They'd gone into the actual court where Aurangzeb, the Emperor Aurangzeb, was sitting. Well, Padam Singh wasn't going to be stopped for anybody. He just went charging in, and he killed both of them. The second man was sort of cowering against a pillar, and the sword went straight through the chap. Because you get accounts in the history of these things, they cut people in half with these things. They're immensely strong, immensely heavy and sharp. They're not beautiful, but they're sharp. And the sword bit into the stone pillar. And if you go to the fort in Bikaner, Junagadh Fort, they still have fragments from the pillar, and the sword is there with a notch in the right place, and I think it is correct. And the man is hugely worshipped. He is actually... he's the stuff of Rajput legend. But he's a living legend. He was actually, and in fact, I'll show you the hilt, because this is, you need to notice this, because this is a typical 17th century hilt, not the rather effeminate things that are currently described as 17th century. You know the man was genuine, because there is a document when the man was killed fighting the Marathas. There's a letter of condolence sent to the Maharaja by the Emperor Aurangzeb about regretting the death of his brother. The document's still there. So it's a genuine person. That is what a Rajput sword should look like in the 17th century. Now, you can argue that the Moguls had something different. I would perfectly accept that. You can argue also that there's a difference between a fighting sword and a court sword. These things are very difficult to assess, but that certainly is what the Rajputs used. Now this is very interesting, because this is Padam Singh's exercise sword. Look at the weight of that. Simply staggering, actually. What's it? Now, it's hard to imagine, but if you go to a gym, my son works out in the gym, and he uses these dumbbell things. He does pretty well on them, actually. I would get a hernia, but he uses them, and I think if you train regularly, and they did train every day, one of the things you did was you actually used a bow, and you had to shoot an arrow into a target, which is like a crate, with baked earth in, and one side was left open. They had them on little wheels so they could push them around, and you had to bury your arrow up to the flights, up to the feathers. And they practiced every day doing that. In the pictures of people doing it in the court, the whole court would turn out and have do their exercise for the day. They were pretty fit. Anyway, that is Padam Singh's sword, and it is not a sword that he had made in Rajasthan. It is something that he collected in his campaigns in the south. There are slight issues. What I particularly like about it, the blade is totally blunt. It's not meant to cut anything. They do puja to this. They worship this every year still in the fort. It is seen as to personify a warrior tradition. But he's got the little marks. If you can see them, just here. Those are sometimes referred to as the bite marks. You get them in various places. Chechnya has them on Chechen swords, a large amount of writing about them. But they are suggesting it's a European blade. There's the hilt. It's quite clearly from, I think it's from Bijapur actually. There's lots of architecture. And one of the things I'm working on is how much you can actually tie objects to architectural detail on the building, because you can date the buildings, and therefore you can possibly, and I can tell you that the architectural detailing is rather out of step with the dates on the objects as given so far. How much you make that work is difficult to say. It's something I'm working on at the moment. That's the sort of blade he was copying when the person made that thing, and the Portuguese supplied large quantities of arms and armour to Vijayanagara. They were holding the balance of power. They were feeding stuff to the different states in the south. And particularly war horses was the thing that if they control the war horses, Albuquerque worked out, if you control the war horses, you can control who wins the wars, and you can therefore control how you deal with trade and trade advantages, etc., from Goa. And there was an account of 56 mule loads of sword blades being sent up to Vijayanagara on one occasion, I remember. I mean, there are plenty more. So that's what he was copying. This sword sums up for me what happens in the sort of 1700 period. The man called Ajit Singh, terribly important. His father's Maharaja up in Afghanistan. He's from Jaipur, but he was sent up there to administer the Mogul Mogul zone, and Aurangzeb had a pretty filthy reputation, sent him a robe, a khilat robe, and he put it on and promptly died. Aurangzeb had a long reputation. Contemporary view was that he poisoned these robes, and sometimes they put smallpox into them, and sometimes they put poison under the armpits, and you put them on and passed out pretty quickly, actually. There are lots of contemporary accounts about it, believe me. Anyway, his son and heir died. It's very important for Hindu because you need a son to officiate your cremation. And he was very upset. And his sort of chief advisor, a man called Durga Das, advised him and said, look, I've just met this holy man who's come from the coast of Baluchistan, and he's brought a little pill of ash, and if you give this to your Maharani, she will conceive a son. And he did. The holy man, there's a tradition called where the goddess, Shilamata, for a reason I better not get into now, she gets chopped into pieces, and where the bits of body fall become shrines. And this is a particularly important shrine on the coast. It's still there. Anyway, Maharaja died. His wives escaped being burnt because they were both pregnant. Two of them were pregnant. And they were brought by Aurangzeb to him, and they were going to be brought up as Muslims. But one of them died at birth, and meanwhile Aurangzeb had taken over control of Jaipur, and the rulers of the ruling princes of Jaipur didn't like this at all. Nobody thought this was acceptable, and they offered to destroy all the mosques, all the temples in Jaipur, if they could put their own person on the gaddi, on the throne. And it was turned down. Aurangzeb said no way. So they decided they would rescue their prince. So what they did, they smuggled the baby out of where he was being held, in a basket and substitute another baby. And the nursemaid dressed up as the mother. And of course, when they discovered the baby was killed, there are lots of stories of women watching their own children who've been substituted for a prince and they're killed. And anyway, this little party of warriors rode for Jodhpur from Delhi, pursued by all the troops that Aurangzeb could throw at them, and they'd all sworn to die in defence of their prince. And they got him home. They managed to lose the attacking party in the foothills, in the mountains, and they got him home. And for the next 30 years, he fought a guerrilla war to try and get his state back. This is his sword. He is a very remarkable man, and on the sword you will see here the goddess Hinglaj Mata. Hinglaj is the shrine where the body fell, and Hinglaj Mata, wearing a crown, riding a lion, he put that on because it was his personal symbol, understandably. It also has his name on, and the hilt is 19th century. Why does it have a 19th century hilt? And this goes to the heart of your collecting. In the 19th century, people took the jeweled hilts off because they scrapped them down. They went through a very bad time. The Marathas were overrunning, and they had to pay ransoms. They had a terrible time. And all the time, the hilts were being taken off, these wonderful jeweled hilts, and they put whatever they had to hand on. That is a very boring late 19th century hilt. Take it from me, it is a piece of rubbish. Here's another one from the same group. Again, look at the weight. The weight's coming down a bit, actually. 210, quite reasonable, really, by Rajput standards. And they really did cut people in half with them, and plenty of accounts of it. And most of the swords came from a place called Sirohi. But that is interesting because it's a water steel blade. And what is happening in the 17th century is that the Rajputs, who have their own weapons, and the Moguls, who have their own weapons, the Central Asian tradition, as opposed to the Rajputs used to fight on foot most of the time, used to ride to the place and fight on foot with short metal spears and swords, big swords. And gradually the two traditions came together. And this is, if you like, a Rajput shamsher. Look at the fat blade. I mean, it's not a shamsher by Persian standards, but it has something else. It has these lines across it. You see? Now that is where the person making it in Sirohi probably never seen a proper shamsher, and he was using billets of steel, and he lap welded them. So you've got a series of lap welds down the blade. Now you would say, well, this is pretty crude, this is not a good thing. But from a Rajput point of view, they would say, this is a mala. What is a mala? A mala is something, that's a mala. They put it on the temple. They tie it around things, and it holds good fortune. It holds good luck. You see them tied around trees. You make a wish and tie your string around a tree, and it stays there for a long time and sort of emanating good vibes. So that's what that is. And that's what a water steel blade should look like. And that's a particularly nice one because it has not only the transverse pattern, which is usually referred to as the 40 steps, but it also has the rings, which is an extremely rare detail. There are about sort of 10 of those in existence as far as I know. I'd be hard-pressed to find more than 10, I think. Now, I've talked a bit about the difficulties of actually saying what is and what isn't Mughal, as opposed to what is Rajput or what is Sikh or whatever. So I thought I'd throw this in to show you how really difficult it gets. This is sword in Bikaner, and it's photographed through glass and with some mesh over it. I'm sorry, it's the best I could do. But the gold decoration on it is very distinctive. It's not at all like the things you get in the 19th century, I'm sure you'll all agree. And what it is it has a very close resemblance to beadry work. Bidar, where this comes from, is in the south, it's in the Deccan. So is that a Mughal sword? Is it a Deccani sword? I can't give you an answer at this moment, but I can show you that detail. And you can see that that is sort of late Shah Jahan style. You think of the inlaid marble on the Taj Mahal and various other places. And I think that is late 17th, early 18th century. And there are a whole group of things going on a bit. If that first one was right, what date do we put on that? Traditionally, everybody would have said, well, that's definitely 17th century. What is it? There's a wonderful remark by a man called Goetz, who lived for many years, a German scholar, a very thorough man, who lived for many years in Bikaner, wrote a very good book in, I think, something like 1946 or thereabouts. Might have been a bit later. Anyway, he said that most of the arms you see in his armory, and Rajasthan generally, The 17th century ones are immensely plain with very little gold on. And I think that's right. I'd reached the same conclusions and assumed that the piece had been sold out of my Jaipur collection. But that wasn't the case. I believe that you have different levels, first of all. You have levels which are pure court, and you can look at the court miniatures. There's no question they're wearing jeweled things. Very little jade until the second half of the 17th century, in my view. The jade is put much too early. You read Jahangir, for example, the first half of the 17th century, practically no references to jade at all. Jade doesn't even appear in the jade daggers aren't even mentioned. And lots of mention of daggers, jewel swords, nothing about jade. And jade was very rare. And until Aurangzeb actually opened up the road to Ladakh with a conquest which enabled him to get the jade out of Kokand, I don't believe they were getting very much. They were getting things passed to them which were Timurid objects and this sort of thing. And they were very proud to have it because they claimed descent from the Timurids. It's very important to them. And they had this liking for jade, no doubt, but they didn't have much of it. Most of the hilts are gold, set with stones. We've seen various other examples already, the one at the beginning. That, to my mind, is an 18th century piece. Goetz's actually comment was that the covering things with gold didn't really start till, and he names a Maharaja, and the Maharaja was late 18th, early 19th. He said only at that period do things start to be covered with gold. Now certainly in the 19th century, the things are covered with gold, no question, a whole lot. You can see it in the Jaipur miniatures. There's a particular phase where suddenly the miniatures have lots and lots of gold. All the people are dressed in sort of gold cloth and all this. You can see there's a sudden change, and you reflect it in some of the objects that have survived. But there is a problem about how much is 17th, how much is 18th, and how much is 19th. And I'm working on that. Sorry, I missed one. Now that, quite clearly, is a 19th century piece, but how early 19th century? I think because of the quillen shape, I would put that early 19th century, but it could be, no, I'm not even sure I'd do that. Sorry, looking at it again. It is exceedingly difficult, but my view is, anyway, that's 19th century, and there are quite a lot done where you have the two patterns, and if you look at that, I mean, that looks like, what's the art movement in the, I mean, it could almost go in here, couldn't it? I mean, the wonderful sort of big leaves and things, it's almost here. It is very difficult because sometimes you get people who are working using traditional things, and sometimes you get them being terribly progressive. But there is a big amount of sales. You have a vast number of Indians who open up shops in England, even in America, and they sell like mad. They sell huge quantities, and they have all these trade fairs and things. And everybody gets very excited, and they start spending lots of money, and they're very successful. They're not satisfied with the traditional thing, which is a bit plain. The Victorians, after all, liked things absolutely covered in decoration. 19th century, everybody wanted everything covered. And if they go out to India, they're going to want something that's really gold and really exotic because they feel they got the money's worth. So of course they're going to put more gold on, and they don't care too much whether the hilt actually works very well or the blade's that good, because it's never going to be used. So the whole value structure changes. This is what you used to have. This has been published many times. It was last in the Maharaja's exhibition. I'm sure you've seen it. In my view, they got it wrong there because this, in fact, is a Rajput hilt, not a Maratha hilt. That design, where there's sort of pointy bits on either side, is pure Jodhpur, and it's also done in Udaipur and one or two other. There are lots of sword centres. And I've got, I don't know, 20 or 30 of them making different swords. And the variations are very small. Each Maharaja, when he came to the throne, organized, set things for himself. He would have his own style of tying a turban, his own shoe design, his own particular costume. Even my Maharaja in Jodhpur has his own turban. It's very good. It looks as though it's made by Pucci, actually. It's a very nice turban. Everybody changed, and they changed the sword hilts. And the chamberlain at the gate would not let the man into court until he was properly dressed, because wearing the right clothes showed you were in alliance. You were a supporter of that particular ruler. So what happened was that going back to the piece before, I'm so sorry, the hilts got taken off. Because, for many reasons, people who had run out of money. Of course, when the British left India, they did a deal with the princes who acceded to the new state of India, and they were given income by Nero, Pandit Nero. They gave up their state money and received a privy purse to cover their expenses. Well, Mrs. Gandhi came along a little later and took it all away. She took 2 years to get it through Congress. She took it all away, and suddenly they had no money at all. And they were busy flogging things like mad because they had to, because if you're a Maharaja, you have buildings to keep up, retainers who perhaps worked for you the last 500 years. You have to actually find the money. I'm afraid the arms and armour was an easy one to get rid of. It's quite portable, and lots of it went abroad, and lots of it got broken up. And in fact, even in England, and I respect here too, until the 80s, when that sort of thing came up in auction, people would say, well, it's not worth a lot, but as scrap value, it's worth more than it is as an intact piece. So they were breaking them up. And I even know of Turkish pistols taken to the Royal Armouries, and Howard Blackmore saying, well, these are wonderful pistols, but they're worth more broken up than I can pay you. So they went. And that's how it was until very recently. And so I have invented a rule, Elgood's rule if you like, that the better the blade, the more likely it is the hilt isn't original and the hilt is a replacement. That is the sort of thing that they were still making at the 1900 period, and I've seen them making those today. Beautiful example. If you want one of those, it costs you about 500 in Jaipur. Beautiful, beautiful things, maybe a bit more now, I don't know, but that's the last one I saw. And they were doing, he was terribly keen to see my pictures because he was doing it himself. He had a book of designs, but he was making it up basically, and he was really interested to see them. But the other thing is, these were both from Jaipur. You can see the very bright bluing. Absolutely brilliant blue, inky blue. If you look at the pieces that were given to the Prince of Wales, who did a tour of India in 75, 76, which are now in Buckingham Palace. You can't actually see them, you have to get special permission, but I can assure you they are as blue as that. They were all taken, and all the princes got new things because they didn't think he'd want some old dagger, and in fact it's most unfortunate because of course lots of the stuff is actually not as good as it might be. But it's blue like that. The bluing is something we give away, and there were schools of art where they were doing bright blue like that. And those, you've got two different hilts. So in other words, you can have a Jodhpur hilt being made in Jaipur. The design is made wherever they happen to be, where they happen to want it. Simple as that. So you can't look at a hilt and say, this is a Jodhpur hilt, and say, therefore it's made in Jodhpur, because in the early period they'd have done it. Later on, they copied. I've got a few more things to show you, and then I'm going to stop because I think I've gone long enough. These, everybody knows these wonderful things. They're always described as Mogul. My question to you is, why are they Mogul? Are they like anything else that's Mogul? I don't think they are. There seems to be a considerable problem about that. We have also a wonderful thing. Those are normally described as Mogul. Well, all I can say is that there are 6 of them sitting in Jaipur, and I believe they're Rajput. And you see those animals all over the place in Rajasthan. Absolutely exquisite. The nice thing about these are, there is a belief that gunpowder is tied up with sexuality, and so most of these have rather well-developed male genitalia, but women also shoot, and there's one with female genitalia, obviously so that the powder horn can be given to women quite safely and not upset them. It's the only one I found. The style carries on, as you can see, in pieces, and these all you have to decide, are these parallel? They're dated at the same date, but they don't sort of fit. Either one is earlier than the other. The whole thing doesn't fit very well. Those are all from, and then of course you have wonderful things like this. That is dagger that I saw first of the Nizam's collection. It was in Switzerland at that stage. It has a flowery head at the top and is quite clearly not a normal Mughal piece. And if you want to know what it actually represents, you have this, which is a scepter, which is this one came out of Mysore, and it is representing that. So immediately you were able to place something away from the Mughals and say, well, this is probably Bijapur actually. There are wonderful things out there that all require rethinking in terms of dates. I haven't done these. The one on the left I've just published. The one on the right, absolutely fabulous piece. I haven't had it in my hands. I'm not sure whether the stones are original or not. They have a tendency to add those, but it is an absolutely fabulous piece. I mean, there are wonderful objects here. And of course, the best technology available at the time goes into making weapons, pretty much as it does today. And finally, I put that in because it is the best shield I know anywhere. It is the most wonderful thing. It's probably late 18th century, or it is late 18th century, and round it you have a story of Maharajas doing various things, including lamping, which is quite fun. Anyway, I think that's probably enough. My time is up. So if you have any questions, please fire away.